Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Necromunda Hired Gun for PC, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Strumon Studio and published by Focus Home Interactive, and it was released on June 1st of this year. And the game's reception upon its launch was pretty much what we have come to expect from Warhammer 40,000 first-person shooters, as in it generally got a pretty mixed reception, with some things being praised about it, most notably things like the art direction, and quite a few other things like the mechanics, the story, and the rather buggy nature of the game getting quite a bit of criticism. And while that unfortunately seems to be an issue with Warhammer 40,000 first-person shooters in general, it's really not much of a surprise given the track record of Strumon Studio. You have to remember that this is the same development studio that made I Divine Cybermancy, as well as the much more recent Space Hulk Deathwing. Both of those games had very rough launches, with Space Hulk Deathwing being the more stable of the two, but even it had a lot of technical problems, and it was a fairly janky game overall. They did eventually improve the game over time with patches, as well as the Enhanced Edition update, which did address some of the criticisms that people had with the original version of the game, but unfortunately in the case of Space Hulk Deathwing, it really wasn't enough to save it. Obviously, with Necromunda Hired Gun being a very recent release, it remains to be seen whether or not it's going to get a similar patching treatment as Space Hulk Deathwing, and thus we just have no way of knowing whether the technical issues that are currently present in the game will be addressed. But it is worth noting that since Space Hulk Deathwing did get a fair bit of patching and even an Enhanced Edition update, it is reasonable to expect that Strumon Studio will at least fix some of the technical issues currently present. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. But as for the game in its current state, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and see what exactly we're dealing with here. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Unreal Engine 4, and for the most part looks pretty good. The environments in particular have that very grungy but also completely ridiculous look that you expect from Warhammer 40,000, and more specifically the setting of the planet of Necromunda, which is an industrial foundry world where basically the entire planet has been converted into one massive weapons factory. This means that most of the environments you're going to be wandering around are not the typical thing you expect from Warhammer 40,000, so not the massive cathedrals and such like that, but rather massive industrial facilities, or old waste disposal areas, and yes, including sewers, or even old facilities that have long fallen into disrepair and basically been abandoned over the centuries, only to become homes for the various gangs. And it's all rendered in quite a lot of detail and looks quite excellent for what it is. The problem is that the environmental art only goes so far, because this is still a video game, and environmental art only goes so far. The rest of the visuals are considerably more of a mixed bag. The modeling and the texture work are generally fine, as are the shaders, but then there are the character designs, most of whom have their faces covered in some way, and it's pretty painfully obvious they did that because they just didn't want to animate the characters' faces. And you only have to look at the characters who do have uncovered faces to understand why. They're not very good at face animations. And speaking of animations, for the most part, the animations in this game really are not very good. The first-person weapon handling animations are mostly fine, at least until they start glitching out on you, but the character animations themselves tend to be very stiff, and when you're actually wandering around and shooting enemies and jumping around and such, you find very quickly that most of the animations start glitching out at a moment's notice. The takedown animations in particular have a really nasty habit of glitching out on you, and when you combine that with the absolutely excessive particle effects, which certainly look nice until you realize that there's so much of them that you can't see what you're doing, it makes the entire game a disorienting mess. And look, I can put up with an awful lot in terms of visuals. They really aren't that important until they start interfering with your ability to play the game, and that is precisely what the visuals in Necromunda Hired Gun do. And things don't really improve much when you move over into the sound design, because in particular the mixing is an absolute disaster. You'll be going through cutscenes where characters are talking and you can't hear them over even the environmental sounds, let alone the music, because the mixing is just off.
So then we wait.
There are only two entrances. They're both sealed, but I need you to keep watch. This is Lothar, my most trusted protector. He will show you where... Quickly! Protect the Citadel!
And while you can at least work around that problem by enabling the subtitles and just reading those whenever you can't hear what somebody's saying, when you're in the middle of running around and shooting enemies and they come in behind you, make plenty of noise, but you still can't hear them because the mixing is broken, well, there's not really much you can do about that. And when you combine that with the frankly kind of awful and extremely repetitive voice acting, where the characters you'll be running into will be saying the same line over and over and over again, one right after the other during combat, it just gets extremely tiresome. That said, at least the gun sounds are mostly pretty good. They've got some very nice chunky sounds for the bolter, and the various guns that you'll be using mostly sound pretty decent, although there are a few that don't sound quite as beefy and powerful as you'd really hope. Like the heavy bolter just lacks a lot of oomph behind it, unfortunately. Unfortunately, though, there's not much consistency between the gun and explosion sounds, because the explosion sounds just aren't anywhere near as beefy as some of the gun sounds are, and that's a real shame. But then there's the music, which is not what you would typically expect from a Warhammer 40,000 game. You normally expect this massive, sweeping, epic, orchestral stuff with lots of choral arrangements, and you just don't get that with Necromunda Hired Gun, because it's not fitting for the setting. The setting is much grungier, it's about gang wars and such like that, so what they've got instead is a lot of electronic music, as well as heavy metal, and it actually works rather well, all things considered. It's certainly not the best music around or anything, but it definitely gets the job done. So when you look at the presentation as a whole, you end up with something that is very much a mixed bag in a lot of ways, and unfortunately, apart from the excellent environmental designs, the visuals and the sound really get in the way more than anything else. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set on the industrial world of Necromunda in the 40k universe, where you play as an unnamed bounty hunter who starts out the game going on a job with two other people. The job goes horribly wrong, and after being rescued by a guilder named Cal Jericho, you are implanted with some extra bionics, which give you some special powers, and you go off on a journey to find the person responsible for all of this mess, the Silver Talon. And, well, let me put it this way. The prevailing thought I had going through the entire game, listening to all of the dialogue, paying attention to what was going on, was that really old meme of the Russian soldier who is sitting there going, "I do not know who I am, I don't know why I'm here, all I know is that I must kill." And really, I think that's the best way to sum up the story of this. You don't really know why you're doing what you're doing in most cases, you're just doing it because it vaguely, kinda, sorta relates to finding the Silver Talon, but not really. All of the characters are completely one note, and a lot of them are just introduced, then thrown away a few seconds later, so you have absolutely no possible chance of getting attached to them or figuring out any sort of motivations or anything. And by the time you get to the end of the game, you've probably forgotten why you were going after the Silver Talon in the first place, other than, oh hey, there's a bounty on their head. You can't even get attached to the protagonist, because the protagonist's sole personality trait is that they're an asshole. And not even a somewhat funny kind of asshole like, say, the Postal dude. Nope, they're just a perpetually angry misanthrope who's only in it for themselves. So the story and the characters just completely fall apart, and you find yourself not giving a single solitary crap about it even almost immediately, let alone once you get further into the game, and thus the fate of the game is really resting entirely on the gameplay. So what is the gameplay of Necromunda Hired Gun? Well, it's a fast-paced first-person shooter with some very light looter elements and a progression system in the form of bionics and the bionics that you can apply to your Mastiff. I'll talk a bit more about that later on, but the core mechanics of the game are that you have 6 weapon slots, 4 of which can be customized when you select your loadout before you go into a mission, one of which is reserved for being able to pick up an additional gun when you go around in the various levels, and one of which is reserved specifically for your starting revolver. And you're not able to replace it with any other weapon. It has to be the basic revolver that you start with. Sure, you can upgrade it in the form of applying various attachments, but you can't even replace it with a weapon of the identical type. So if you find another revolver that's, say, a +2, you can't just swap that out for your starting revolver. You're still stuck with the absolutely pathetic starting revolver. This means that while that weapon slot is fine when you're just starting out the game and are only going to have access to the most bare-bones weapons, once you get a couple of levels in, it effectively becomes dead weight, and you're not really going to bother with it ever again. So that slot being locked to just that starting revolver does eventually get pretty annoying, and it's especially annoying when you look at the grand scheme of what you're able to set up as far as your loadout goes. Because out of the 4 weapon slots that you can customize, 2 of them are limited to pistols, and 2 of them are for whatever other weapons you want to carry, whether it be the so-called basic weapons, like auto guns or bolters, or special weapons like the long las, which is a laser sniper rifle, or the grenade launcher, or even heavy weapons like the heavy auto guns or the heavy bolters. And then there's an additional weapon slot aside from all of those that is for just a weapon that you can pick up when you're wandering around the levels, and it can be any weapon, whether it's a heavy weapon, special, basic, or even a pistol. And no matter what else you pick up, it's always going to swap out for that particular weapon slot. It's just a really bizarre way of handling the loadout, and it certainly doesn't help that the interface for all of this is just a mess. Your actual selectable loadout consists of the 4 weapon slots, as well as 1 slot for your armor, 4 slots for your special status items, and then a bunch of equipment you can just have, like medkits or diffusers or grenades. But your actual inventory has 4 slots for armor, including the one you have equipped, as well as a few slots for your equipped weapons, and additional slots for weapons that you just have, that are in individual categories, so basic, special, heavy, and pistols. And then you also have a bunch of slots for Archaeotech as well as Lucky Charms, which are attachments that you can place on the various weapons. It's just all not very well thought out, and when you actually start messing around with the interfaces for weapon customization and such like that, you find out very quickly that there's really no reason for any of it. The actual weapons themselves don't behave significantly differently based on which attachments you have, and the only major benefits you'll notice are from going from the basic version to the +1, to the +2, and maybe the +3 versions. With the only major benefits you'll ever notice being that your damage numbers are going up, and that's about it. It also doesn't help that the actual weapon variety is rather limited, where you only have a very small number of weapon types, and the weapons you're going to be finding are either basic, +1, +2, or +3 variants of those weapons, and you're not getting anything truly unique out of them for the most part. And of the various weapon types, you find out very quickly that the bolter is the single most effective out of all of them, and thus you're probably going to always have that in your loadout. So that means you're basically only going to have 1 weapon slot to play around with as far as primary weapons go, and eventually you're probably just going to settle into that being a grenade launcher for the crowd control. And it's that word settle that really describes the gameplay loop of Necromunda Hired Gun. Because from the way the game and the trailers act, you should have all manner of things that you can experiment with, but there's no reason to. You can very easily just settle into a rhythm of use bolter for direct damage, use grenade launcher for crowd control, and occasionally use the bionic abilities when you get bored. And even the bionic abilities really aren't all that useful. You have one that shoots out a blast that's supposed to be particularly effective against shielded enemies, but it has no real impact behind it. You've got a crush ability that sends you charging forward and blasting an enemy in melee, but the targeting on it can be really messy, and so sometimes you actually won't connect with it, or even if you do connect with it, it is so fast that it actually is kind of disorienting. You've got a strength booster that makes you pull out your knife and just start running around meleeing things, basically like the Berserk mode in Doom, and then you've got a heightened senses ability that is just bullet time. It's all remarkably unsatisfying, and the controls for it can be fairly clunky, because you're intended to either set something to a hotkey cast, or to use a radial menu to select the one you want to use, but in order to set the hotkey cast, you have to go into the radial menu and then press the hotkey cast button when you've highlighted the one you want to use, and if you don't do it right, then you'll just cast the ability and not set the hotkey. Now sure, you can go into the options menu and set specific hotkeys for each individual ability, but you don't really need to, because for the most part you don't need to use any of these abilities. They're just there for flavor. I mean, do you really need the perfect aim ability that basically turns you into RoboCop? No, because the enemies are so brain-dead stupid that they charge directly at you and make themselves wide open to even the most concussed amoeba anyway. Do you really need to use the ability that's supposed to deactivate enemy shields, or the ability that allows you to blast enemies from a distance, or the one that allows you to close the distance and blast them in melee? No, because not only do the enemies just charge directly at you, all you have to do is just keep shooting them until they fall over. Even if you are constantly wasting ammo, you will still never run out of ammo in this game, because the enemies will drop ammo boxes, and those will replenish ammunition for all of your weapons. Hell, you don't even need to use the med kit most of the time, because when you take damage, there is a brief period after that where you can actually replenish health by damaging enemies. So as long as enemies are still shooting at you with their mostly hit-scan weapons, you're constantly healing anyway. And as if the constant health regen from just damaging enemies right after they damage you wasn't enough to keep you around, you can just run up to an enemy and perform a takedown animation on them, and not only will this always replenish some health regardless of whether you've just taken damage or not, but you're also invincible while the animation is going on, so enemies can just keep blasting you and it does nothing. And even if you somehow aren't able to replenish enough health and the enemies are able to take you down, well, they give you a stim item that automatically puts you back up to full health and full shields, and they activate automatically when your health bottoms out, and you can carry 3 of them, and they're plentiful. And on top of all of this, you don't even have to use the advanced movement techniques. The game gives you the ability to double jump, to wall run, to slide on the ground, and even to use a grappling hook. But out of all of those special abilities, the only ones that you'll actually be using on any frequent basis are the double jump and the grapple. And frankly, you'll probably be using the grapple more as a tool to rip enemies' shields out of their hands in a frankly extremely underwhelming manner because they don't even react to it at all, and not so much as a tool for getting around the environments. It's like the developers just didn't have a good grasp of the core mechanics and didn't really know what they wanted to do with the game, so they just threw a bunch of crap in there and hoped it would work, and unfortunately, it just doesn't. Take, for example, one of the biggest things they hyped up in the game, which is the Mastiff, your supposed constant companion, except that the Mastiff is on a cooldown, and whenever you summon them, it just kind of pops out of nowhere, and then does some things for a bit, then goes away until the cooldown expires. The further you get into the game, the less you're going to be using the Mastiff because it ends up being a liability more than an asset, and that's even when you are upgrading all of the bionics for the Mastiff. Because the simple fact of the matter is that as long as you're upgrading your own bionics, you're basically going to be steamrolling everything because it upgrades the efficiency of, in particular, your health regenerating capabilities. And as I mentioned, as long as you keep doing damage to enemies, no matter how much they damage you, you're basically never going to die in this thing. Meanwhile, the Mastiff doesn't get that, so while you're sitting there and basically able to tank all the damage in the universe, the Mastiff will show up, take a couple of shots, and almost immediately go back on cooldown because it doesn't have such regenerative capabilities. And even if it doesn't go almost immediately back on cooldown due to taking damage, it's probably going to glitch out anyway because the Mastiff AI is, much like the rest of the AI in this game, pretty much broken. Its targeting will mess up all the time. It'll get stuck on things. It'll refuse to go into certain locations even though there's nothing preventing it from going there. It just ends up being a mess. And the worst part is, it has some of the better AI in the game, because as I mentioned before, the enemy AI is brain dead to begin with. They'll basically just charge you and nothing else. But also, a lot of the times, they just don't even really do anything. They'll just stand around and let themselves be shot to bits in a manner that makes victims of stealth archery in Skyrim look like they're geniuses. And when you bring it all together, it's basically a train wreck of a game. It gives the illusion of non-linearity, but it's a very linear first-person shooter that's maybe about 6 to 7 hours long, depending on your difficulty setting. And while you can go off and do side missions to raise your standing with some of the factions, and to get some extra money so you can purchase more upgrades, you don't need to, and in fact it just sends you back to areas you've already been in, fighting the same generic enemies you had already fought over and over and over again, just so you can eventually get some extra upgrades, or maybe even get a faction reward, which is just gonna be an item anyway, and you're probably not gonna get much use out of it. It just makes the entire Necromunda hired gun experience a very frustrating mess, because you can see moments here and there where something was starting to shine through, because after all, even though the balancing is all manner of screwed up, the weapon handling is actually pretty good, and the effect on target can be pretty satisfying. But then it just gets buried under a mess of technical problems and bad AI and bad design decisions that ultimately just result in the game not being worth playing. Ultimately, it's a 1.5 out of 5. Maybe once they patch the game and get some of those bugs fixed, and maybe if they improve the interface and such, it might get up to a 2. But without some fundamental redesigns, it's not going to get any higher than that, and frankly, I just cannot recommend this to anybody. Thanks for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.